All right. Well, welcome to School Choice Wisconsin's Quality Series. We're super excited to share today's session with you. Today, we're diving into the Special Needs Scholarship Program, commonly referred to as the SNSP. As advertised, our approach for today's session will target those folks who've already heard the SNSP basics. You've probably seen a presentation that gives you a nice overview, but you still have questions. And so we're going to be focusing our time on what we've pulled together as our top 10 questions that we regularly receive from schools. Anyone is welcome to listen in, but I would recommend that if you haven't sat through one of our presentations on just the basics of SNSP, please reach out to me and we can schedule a more comprehensive onboarding for you. So I'm going to have us move on to introductions. First off, my name is Carol Shires with School Choice Wisconsin, and I'm excited today to be joined by Kasper and Lauren Beckmann from FIRE Foundation of Milwaukee. So I'm wondering, Katie, if you'd like to start by just introducing yourself, sharing a little bit of your background, and then Lauren could do the same.
Thank you, Carol. I am Kasper, Board President of FIRE Foundation of Milwaukee. Just to share a little bit about FIRE Foundation for those that aren't familiar with it, we are an organization that supports the education of students with disabilities in the Catholic schools within the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And we do that primarily in two ways. One is through consultation and the other is through private grant funding. So we spend a lot of time talking with schools about the SNSP because it's really important to our mission. And I'll let Lauren introduce herself.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here as well. I'm Lauren Beckmann. I am a retired principal of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee with experience in implementing the SNSP for about 30 students annually. I also have a passion which continues for full inclusion of complex learners in the schools of their parents' choice, particularly in faith-based schools. And I am also a FIRE board member.
Excellent. Thank you so much, ladies. I'm really just so thrilled that you could join and help today answer these top 10 questions plus more. Katie, I'm going to start with you with our first question of the day in no particular order. What can you spend SNSP money on?
Okay, I'm going to begin this answer with a caveat, which is that I'm not going to get into the interplay of the reserve fund with this question because that's going to be addressed a little bit later on in the presentation. So setting aside the question of the reserve fund, a couple of things that I think are really important to know about using the money. First, as it relates to student specificity, the scholarships come into the school and they are provided on behalf of a specific student who has applied and been accepted to the program. And it's important to understand that although that money is associated with that student applicant, there is no guideline that says the funds have to stay specifically with that student. So once the money comes into the school, yes, you can choose to tie it to the specific student on whose behalf it was received and pay for services for that student, but you do have the flexibility to use that funding for other purposes, including needs of other students in the SNSP or other services that maybe aren't directly related to a specific student. Again, setting aside the implications for the reserve fund, you don't have to track student-specific expenditures in order to tie them back to the scholarship that you received or anything like that. The second thing that is important to understand is you can use the funds for really a variety of categories of expenditures. So it could be services that might be a special education teacher, a one-on-one aid. Sometimes it's therapies. It could be equipment. So if you have a student with sensory needs and related equipment or seating needs and you need specific types of furniture, maybe it's a student with a hearing or vision impairment and that requires equipment. That's another category of items. Curriculum would be another really broad category that's a common expenditure. But again, there isn't a rule that says that those items have to fall into any of those three common categories I just named. They don't have to be listed in the student's IEP as written by the public school. And actually, they don't even have to be written in a service plan that is established between the parent and the school. So there's really a lot of flexibility on what you can spend the funds on. Important to know, if you have a child with a public school IEP, maybe they have certain types of therapy in there. Oftentimes the therapy that you would see in that IEP is really guided by what the student is due under federal law, and also what is eligible for special ed aid reimbursement. As private schools, there's much more flexibility in saying, okay, the student has a need that is outside of those two categories of services or equipment, and we really want to meet that need, and so we're going to spend the funds on that. An example I could think of would be, I know of students who've had music therapists come into their private school, and SNSP funds have been spent on that. You would not be able to get music therapy in a public school IEP. It would not be eligible for special ed aid reimbursement, but schools have decided that that's an important part of the child's programming in conjunction with the parents, and elected to spend funds on that. So you do have a lot of flexibility, and you can really be student-centric when you think about what you're going to do with the funds, which is a beautiful opportunity for private schools in particular.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Lauren, I'm going to give you the next one. Does the SNSP negate the IDEA services for those students, or do the district service plans continue after a child is in the SNSP?
Okay, this is a complex question, so stay with me on this. First of all, we have to understand the difference between IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that is a federal act, and the SNSP, which is a state program. So there are different funding sources and different regulations that apply to each. Children who are parentally placed in parochial or private schools, as you likely already know, lose their individual entitlement to special education services. But as an aggregate group, they are entitled to a formulaic share in those IDEA, those federal dollars that are expended on behalf of all special education students in your school, as agreed upon in your annual equitable services agreement. So SNSP students that are part of that aggregate group will continue to receive any services in the agreement that apply to them as individuals. Speech language therapy is a good example in this area. So if your equitable services agreement determined that the public school would provide speech and language services for students in your school who have IEPs that met classification for speech language disability, those students, whether they receive SNSP funds or not, would continue to receive services within that service agreement. Okay, what does not continue is FAPE, or Free Appropriate Public Education. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we sort of break down the difference between FAPE and SNSP. So the second question, do district service plans continue? Well, the short answer is yes. The plans that are implemented as part of agreed upon equitable services will continue for services for students enrolled in SNSP.
Okay, I'm going to take the next one. A really common question we get is, can a student be in both choice and SNSP? And the quick answer to that is no, they may not. But I do want to talk through this a little bit, because there is a little bit of some nuances here that you should be aware of, depending upon the timing. So if you would expect that a student would qualify potentially for either program, they might want to go ahead and submit a choice application as a backup plan. And let me explain that. For instance, if your school will be new, first applying this spring for the SNSP, you cannot accept any SNSP applications before July. They all become available July 1st for the next school year. In the meantime, that family could choose to submit a choice application to secure a seat for the fall in your school, if indeed you're in the choice program, as kind of a backup plan in case things fall through with the SNSP. So how that would work is this summer, when those applications become available in July, that family could apply for the SNSP, and they've already, let's say applied this spring for a choice seat and gone through those processes and secured their seat. In July, they apply for the SNSP or sometime throughout the summer. And if everything goes through with that application process the way it's supposed to, at the juncture that they have been given a seat with SNSP, you'll need to get from the parent a very clear written statement explaining that they want to relinquish their choice seat and choose the SNSP seat instead. And that's it. And then you'll just need to hold on to that statement in your file for the auditor to see. And then they can keep rolling through the SNSP, but they definitely cannot be in both programs at once. And since the choice program has limited application windows, that's why I say there's some nuances to the answer to this. You're going to want to think through the timing to just make sure the parent gets every possible opportunity for that child. And the next one here is back to Lauren.
So the question is, do you have to accept any student, even those with needs you feel are too severe? And this is probably the most common question that I have received through the years. And then we have a couple of related questions related to this one. So the first way that I would answer that is to say that you control who applies for your program through the design of your program. As part of the SNSP application process, you will write a school profile that includes a description of the services that you offer and the qualifications of your staff. Now, that profile will be published on the state SNSP site. So in theory, every parent who applies through SNSP as a cold application should already know if your school is an appropriate fit for their child. But in case they don't, every parent who applies will also be provided with, must be provided with an SNSP document that does a side-by-side comparison between FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education, and SNSP. And they have to indicate that they understand that they're giving up their right to a free appropriate public education by enrolling their child in SNSP. Those documents, along with the child's IEP, then would guide an individual consultation you would have with the parents. And that consultation should really determine whether or not the school can adequately meet the needs of that particular child. In my experience, if the school is very clear that the child needs services that will not be provided, it's likely that the parents would decline to enroll. I've never seen or had a parent push back on that. But if they want to give it a try, the school does have to enroll applicants in the order received. That is a regulation of the program, with the single exception for siblings that are already enrolled in your school. They may be given priority enrollment status. That being said, the goal here is to open doors of access to expand parental choice, lowercase p, lowercase c, and support us in building better educational options for disabled students. So the flip side of this conversation is that your school profile does not limit what you can offer. And that'll sort of tie back to what Katie said earlier. Remember that not every student in the program will require services outside of general education. Some require really only expanded expertise of the classroom teacher, which doesn't cost any more, and which naturally will come with more diverse experience. The grants for those uncomplicated students, though, are the same as the grants for a more complex student. And the differential money can fund services for those more complex learners. For example, if you have 4 students with speech language IEPs who do not require special services beyond the general education, they will still bring in $60,000 roughly in SNSP grants. And that money could fund a special education teacher or a couple of special education aides or whatever you determine a particular child might need. So when you're having that consultation with a family, you want to also remember that this is an opportunity for you to be open-minded and to look at your program more comprehensively and think about whether or not this child would be a good add for your school. Once you increase the knowledge capacity of your faculty to serve students with disabilities, SNSP should be looked at as a program that enables you to exponentially expand the services you offer by design, though, not by mandate. So this is a grand opportunity, I think, to distinguish your school by offering something unique, something that even public schools do not offer. As Katie said, the music therapy for a child who would benefit from that. At my former school, we hired a learning disabilities teacher who had advanced dyslexia certification, and we were able to offer dyslexia remediation, something that public schools do not even identify within the general disability classification of specific learning disabilities. So these are distinguishers that can set your school apart. Every conversation with a parent of a complex learner is an opportunity for you to consider expanding services by looking at your funding availability more holistically. So that would answer that.
Sorry, Lauren, I didn't mean to
That's quite all right.
move forward too quickly. Okay, what happens when a child no longer qualifies for special education services? This is a common question we get. To review, in the SNSP, remember, parents still need to make their child available for those district reevals every 3 years. And if in one of those evaluations, they're determined to no longer need services for their disability, the student can still remain in the SNSP program, but the amount of their scholarship decreases to match the amount of the choice voucher that year. The student does not become a choice student, just the amount of the scholarship changes. And this is called a partial scholarship. However, once a child is on a partial scholarship, they may no longer transfer that scholarship to another school in the SNSP. So it does pose that limitation, but they're not removed from the SNSP program. And just remember, the SNSP is completely separate from the choice program. The student would need to apply for choice and meet those eligibility criteria at a new school if they were on that partial scholarship. They would not get any priority in the choice program just because they used to be in the SNSP program. So just keep that in mind with those partial scholarships. Back to Lauren.
So Catholic identity, and I know we have some Lutheran schools and other faith-based schools in our audience as well, so I would extend this answer to all faith-based schools. I think it's important to understand that threats to freedom of religion and religious liberty are legal issues that your church hierarchy and lobbyists like WCHRIS will address on your behalf. To paraphrase our Catholic school superintendent, individual schools will not have to address assaults on our religious identity. Attorneys for the larger church will protect your rights. So the short answer here is don't let fears of restrictive regulations hold you back from participating in the program, that we all have people higher up who are watching closely and who will bring a legal challenge against anything that would threaten our religious identity.
The next question is, how does the SNSP reserve fund work? Before I answer that, I do see a couple questions in the chat flowing in. So I think I'm going to just pause momentarily to answer those. First of all, the first question was, what if you're not in a choice program and you have that student that gets reevaluated and put on a partial scholarship? The state just uses as a marker that amount of the choice voucher to determine the amount of the partial scholarship for the SNSP. The programs are still completely unrelated, and the school does not need to be in the choice program in order for that to happen. That's just the dollar amount that the state has chosen to use. The next question there, for how many years can a student receive a partial scholarship? There is no limit to that as long as they stay at their same school. So they can, graduate out of your school, 8th grade, 12th grade, whatever the top grade is. And the other thing is too, in case this doesn't come out later, for those of you who are new to this, the really neat thing with the SNSP program is parents don't even have to reapply every year. It's much, much simpler, frankly, from that standpoint than the choice program. So once they've gone through that initial application period, they're set as long as they're at your school. They don't have to worry about missing a deadline for reapplying every year. And then, are you able to update your school's profile after you've been in the program a while? Lauren, maybe you want to take this one since you've had to do that.
Yes, absolutely. You may update the profile at any time. You will be asked to update it annually when you file your intent to participate. And you don't have to make changes, but that's a good annual opportunity to take a look at what have we got out there on our profile, and is this an opportunity to make some updates. You likely would want to for sure check your staff qualifications page and make sure that that's kept up to date annually at least.
Another question out there, how is a student impacted if they do not utilize the SNSP program in consecutive years? Would they just need to apply again? And yes, that is the case. So if there would be a break in enrollment and they would leave for whatever reason, choose to leave the program, they would start from square one again at the time that they wanted to come back into the program. All right, so we're going to go on to talk briefly about the reserve fund. And
Carol, sorry to interrupt. Did you answer Christine's question? How would you spend that partial scholarship money if you were no longer using it for the IEP?
thank you, Natalie. I did not see that. Thank you for bringing that
Okay.
up.
I just want to make sure all questions are answered.
Yes, that's my colleague Natalie, who's being tremendously helpful here. Thank you so much. Katie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that actually a little bit farther in the presentation, but for now I'll just say it really actually is a huge opportunity. And I think the question maybe is, I don't know, maybe not from you specifically, but in general is born of the idea that most times we're scrambling for funds at our schools, and this is a place where there's funding that can empower us to do things we usually wouldn't be able to do. So going back to the very first slide, there aren't a lot of specific rules about how that funding must be spent. So you have some options, and one of those options is to use that to fund a holistic program at your school. And I can get into that a little more in a minute.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to start to talk a little bit about the reserve fund. We will have a variety of questions coming up that are financial related here, and they're going to kind of intertwine. So what I'm going to do right now is give you the basics for this and not get too much buried in the weeds, and we can circle back and get more detailed later on. So how does the SNSP fund, reserve fund work? Each summer, following the close of your school year, your school will be required to have a gap financial audit by an approved CPA firm of your choice. This audit will verify the amount of your eligible education expense. And as Katie explained earlier, most everything can count as an eligible education expense. This cost to educate the child is compared to the amount of SNSP money the state is sending to your school. So if you have multiple SNSP students, and this is what Katie was kind of alluding to there, it's the total amount of money that they're sending you for all those SNSP children compared to the cost for all of those kids. Part of that cost is it's in portions. Part of it is strategically targeted funding towards those individual students with their special needs. But then there's just a base educational cost for every single child that comes in the door. And you're able to include both of those portions to develop the overall cost to educate. So you have these two numbers when after the audit is completed of your cost to educate in total of those SNSP kids versus how much they sent you. And if you don't use it all on a given year, that excess is tracked and is called the SNSP reserve. If at some point in the future, your school pulls out of the SNSP program for any reason, and there is a reserve balance still sitting there, that reserve balance does need to be returned to the state. In the meantime, you're welcome to invest that reserve balance and earn interest on that reserve. And Katie.
So the next question is, how can SNSP funds be used to accommodate students with needs that exceed the scholarship amount? I think this is a really important question because when you think about kids with IEPs, I'd venture to say most of them fall into two specific categories. You're going to have a lot of students whose needs are actually meaningfully below the $15,000-ish scholarship amount. And then you'll have some students whose needs exceed that amount by actually a pretty meaningful gap. And the students I'm thinking here in the category with fewer service needs, especially from a financial perspective, are students with speech therapy needs, ADHD, some of the other specific learning disabilities. And then if you kind of think of the other group, think of kids who have one-on-one aids or extensive therapy or pull-out. Often that's students with autism, students with Down syndrome, other genetic conditions, kids who have vision and hearing impairments tend to have real educational needs that exceed $15,000 kind of year in and year out. So the question would be, how can you leverage the funding available in the program to serve that sort of second group of kids? And I'll start by just talking about what is known as an actual cost scholarship. The basic scholarship amount is just over $15,000 right now. But if you have a student whose very specific special education costs exceed $15,000, you then have an option, and it's a student by student and year by year election. So you could choose it some years, you can choose it for some students and not others. What you would do is report the costs to the DPI. They provide a form for this. They usually provide it right at the beginning of July, and it's due a few weeks later. So you want to have done some preparation up front. But you can list on that form in two different categories: personnel costs that again are direct special education expenses. So that's commonly one-on-one aides that are on your staff, special education teachers on your staff. At times we see schools with speech therapists that are actually employed at the school. And then there's a separate category for listing invoices. So you may have contracted services. That's often some of those lower incidence therapies like OT and PT. You might have purchased specialized curriculum or equipment. All of those things go on an invoice list. And the form is actually, once you understand it, pretty simple to fill out. It totals up all the expenses, and it will then recalculate a new scholarship amount just for that student for the subsequent school year. So again, you're filing this statement of actual cost in July related to the prior school year. And then they're very careful about the language. It's not a reimbursement of the expenses. It's simply a new scholarship amount for that student for the next school year. And that there is no limit on what that new scholarship amount is. It's based on a formula, and I'm going to state it here, but it's written on the DPI website as well, or you may want to play this back. It's dollar for dollar up to 150% of the scholarship amount. So about $22,500. On top of that, if the costs exceed even that amount, the scholarship will be increased by 90% of the incremental amount. So the biggest delta that you can have between the expenses you had in the prior year and the scholarship will be 10% of the amount over about $22,500. The way I like to say it is substantially all of the child's educational expenses for special education services and equipment will be funded for the next year. This is a huge benefit, and relatively few schools are taking advantage of it. In fact, there's only a handful of students this school year who are on actual cost scholarships. Again, there's no limit on the amount that you can include in a statement of actual cost. And this is really the key to unlocking services for those kids who are much more complex learners and have greater service needs. I'm going to point out, though, the very tricky part of this. You do not ever get back the funding that would have been needed for the expenses in the first year. So that first year you bring on a student, let's say they have, there are students with up to $100,000 of annual special education costs for their services or more. You are still only going to get $15,000 for that student in the first year. And that is really a limiting factor for many schools in accepting those students because it's difficult to solve the first year of funding. So the second part of my answer to this question is, what do you do about that? And there are many, many options. First of all, there are private organizations that can help fund that. FIRE Foundation, I mentioned, is one. We work with Catholic schools within the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, but I'm personally aware of many other foundations that work with Lutheran schools, Christian schools in general, and would love to fund these kinds of projects. So that's one place to look. But from my perspective, an easier and more sustainable and reliable source of funding for that type of first year cost for a more complex learner is actually within the program itself. And this dovetails with what Lauren discussed a few slides ago. You have really a great funding stream if you think of the program comprehensively and holistically. And I'll kind of frame it a certain way for everyone. We see a lot of schools who do what we call very simple use of the SNSP. They take the kids that they currently have on IEPs, they put them in the program, they dust off their hands, they collect the funds, and it works well for serving those specific students. And in fact, if you take the kids that already are in your school with IEPs, I'd venture to say you're going to end up with extra money on your hands. This sort of next level of complexity is to look at other learners within your school who have not, for a variety of reasons, undergone an IEP evaluation, and look and see if there are some who maybe could go through that process and be added to the program. It's roughly 15% of public school students who are on IEPs. So if you have a number much lower than that at your school, you could probably assume that you have kids already in the door who could qualify for the program if they went through that IEP evaluation process. And then the last part, the sort of most complex way of using the program is, again, to file those statements of actual cost and think about opening your doors to kids with really complicated service needs. When you start thinking about the program holistically and think of, almost separate your special ed program from the funding source. Think of the SNSP as a source of funding, but then think of separately what your specific special ed program is at your school. It really allows you to serve all of your learners more effectively. There was a question earlier about the partial cost scholarship and what do you do with that? Or I'm sorry, partial scholarship. What do you do with that when the student's not even receiving services anymore? Well, that funding can go into what you would think of as the pool of special ed funding at your school and continue to serve needs that exceed the scholarship. You're going to have annually those kids with fewer service needs that can balance out the ones with excess costs. You also are going to see a situation where you essentially have building up that reserve over time, the opportunity to think of that as a place where you can keep funds for future needs because they're not going to be level year after year. So again, thinking of the program more holistically allows you to have some of that flexibility. I'll also add that with the 2 deadlines for adding kids to the program, some of the schools we've worked with have realized that you may have a kid whose needs arise at a time of year when you can't capture the funding for them, or you can't capture the full year funding for them. And this allows you to start services for them right away, because again, you're thinking comprehensively instead of sort of it's student by student about the funding.
So Katie, I'm going to have a couple questions that have come through that I'm going to pick and choose that relate to what you're talking about right now. One of them, I think you just answered, but just to make sure that everyone heard it. Angela asked whether or not you can use a reserve balance from a previous year in a subsequent year. And you kind of alluded to that a little bit just moments ago.
Yes, Yeah, so the reserve balance is calculated by adding sort of rolling the current year's calculation into the prior year's balance. And so, yes, it carries over year to year and can be increased or reduced based upon the current year's services delivered.
And then kind of relating to that conversation, first of all, I'll take the one question is the SNSP reserve balance calculated separately from the Milwaukee and the Racine Choice Program reserve balance? And yes, it is. It has its own separate reserve balance schedule that is calculated. Although if you're in both the programs, you're going to see that, you know, there's a little bit of crossover here because of that base educational expense that is across the board, basically, for the kids that are walking through your door. So I can give a more detailed explanation of that potentially offline if you need it, but it is calculated separately. Along those lines, sticking with that actual cost question there, is there a way, Katie, for someone, for an actual cost student, do they get is there a way to get funding for general cost per student, those basic classroom teachers, not just the specific cost for that child?
Mm-hmm. The short answer to that question is no. The way that the actual cost statement works is there's a very well-defined set of services and other types of expenses that can be included, and the cost of a general education classroom definitely would not apply. If you wanted to broadly define it, it's really those special education services only, and they have to relate directly to the student. If you look at the way it's defined in the law, if you're familiar with what is considered a service under the IDEA in a public school, it actually very closely or almost exactly mirrors that. So for those that are familiar with that, that's a quick way to understand what it is. So for example, the music therapy I referenced earlier, you can provide it with SNSP funds. You could not put that on a statement of actual cost. It would not qualify. I do want to make sure I'm clear, though. It doesn't have to be a teacher or another professional or even a curriculum that only serves that specific student. If you have, say, for example, a special education teacher and they're serving 10 students, but only one of them, it makes sense to file a statement of actual cost for. You need to have a record of the minutes that that teacher spends with the student in question and use that to sort of portion out that student's share of the cost of that teacher. So it has to relate directly to the student, but it doesn't have to be a service or an educator that only works with that specific student. You know, same thing for the cost of a curriculum if it's split among several students, as an example.
And another question came in, can SNSP money be used for general school needs? And again, this kind of relates to, I've been saying that kind of that base educational expense. So yes, when they're doing the calculation for a traditional SNSP student, you include that. However, if you have one of these students with more complex needs and you've chosen to use the actual cost model, then those general school expenses don't play into that. Katie, anything to add to that? Was that clear?
Good.
Okay. And Lauren, do you want to take, so we don't miss it here, Teresa had a question above saying, it's my understanding that I'm able to take the public school IEP and turn it into a service plan for my school. I'm wondering if they decided a child needs a specific amount of OT or other service, and we think to cut that because we can provide it without the specialist, do we have to follow everything in the IEP?
Okay, that really leads into, I think, our next slide, if you want to just flip. No, I thought we had a question about public school IEPs, so I will just answer it here. SNSP schools are required to implement the most recent IEP or services plan as modified by agreement between the school and the student's parents, plus any related services that are not included in the plan. So I'm going to say that one more time because this is the language that's used. It's very important, but then I will break it open for you. SNSP schools are required to implement the most recent IEP or services plan as it is modified by agreement between the school and the student's parent, plus any related services that you would decide to add. So this agreement that you are going to write must be in writing, and it must be signed by the parent by a certain date. It used to be August 1st, but I think that may have, or August 31st rather, but I think it may have changed to the first enrollment audit date. You would have to double check on that. Schools are also required to submit quarterly reports on a designated DPI form in which you will document agreed upon services, related services that were not in the IEP, and the progress that the child made. And you can include attachments to that form, such as if you have, your own reporting forms, intervention reports or report cards, things of that nature. But you do have to start with that basic DPI form. So the answer here is really that you will modify that original public school IEP in agreement with the parent so that it fits services that you're able to offer and that you believe that the child needs, like the music therapy, example from earlier. Anything that you decide that the child needs that's not in the IEP can be included. And if you feel like you have a different way of delivering the services than what the IEP specifies, you may modify it. It just needs to be in writing on whatever format you choose to use. You might call it a student success plan. You might call it an intervention plan, whatever you call it. It just has to have the descriptor of the SNSP services agreement plan at the top, and that is the information that then becomes the guide for that individual child's program. I hope that makes sense.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to look at a few more questions that have come in. I did put in the chat that magic date is by the count date. That's when that modified IEP needs to be signed in order for a school to get payment. For first semester, it's the third Friday in September, and for second semester, it's the second Friday of January. Let's see here. Lisa's question, if we would be willing to serve a population, example, a deaf student, but we currently do not have a deaf or hard of hearing teacher or interpreter, do we have those people hired and qualifications listed at the time we submit our profile? Well, that's a great question. Or can we simply state that we would contract for those services if someone applied, etc.? So that's a great question. How do you handle this profile that has to be submitted in a few weeks here, and you haven't hired all those folks yet?
I think two things. One, you specify services that you already have developed. And secondly, that you would indicate an openness to expanding services for specific students that may apply. So I think the profile has to say what you already have. And I think it needs to be pretty specific because you do have to list the DPI licenses, for example, of your faculty that will be implementing the services. And if you haven't done the hire yet, you obviously wouldn't be able to do that. So I think expand the profile as you expand the services would be what I would specify. So I think you're going to publish a profile that's accurate and current on the front end, and then on the back end, you're going to be working to expand those services and update your profile when you do.
Okay, I'm going to circle back to a couple of these later because I think they are going to be on our slides. But let's talk about Christine's question. She says, if she buys a supplementary reading curriculum, uses it on 6 kids, 3 are SNSP, does that mean she can only pay for half that curriculum with SNSP money? Katie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so it's sort of a tricky question because it depends on which context you're talking about it. So for purposes of the reserve fund only pulls in expenses and revenues related to those, the 3 kids who are in the SNSP. in terms of like tracking the actual cash in your pocket, you can spend it on things that are going to benefit other kids in various ways. If you consider that you probably also are, it's sort of hard to describe, but you can kind of think of the general ed expenses that are going to be included in your reserve fund calculation for those kids in the SNSP. Well, maybe you're not actually spending your SNSP funds on those because you may have tuition for those kids, or you may have another funding source that could be your church or something like that. So if you think about instead that you spent your tuition dollars on that. Well, if you think about the SNSP funds as paying for those gen ed costs for purposes of the reserve calculation, then that means that you have probably excess SNSP funds, or I'm sorry, you have excess tuition funds that came in the door that you can kind of think of as a backdoor way to pay for it. So it's complicated to explain, but from a reserve perspective, that will not go into your reserve calculation. From an actual cost scholarship perspective, of course, students who are not in the SNSP aren't eligible. I do think most schools will find that they are not going to build an SNSP reserve unless they're spending almost no funds on special education services, and therefore you probably won't see that play into the calculation at a later date.
Okay, and we're going to answer Cheryl's question, I think, and then we're going to move on to the next slide to make sure we get through our top 10 in time, and then we'll circle back and try to make sure everybody's question is answered. So Lauren, I'm going to pitch this one to you. Does the school district continue to hold an annual review of the IEP every year?
Once a child is in SNSP, that will only happen with the 3-year triennial reevaluation. So the short answer is no, that will not happen every year.
And then,
could I add something about that, Carol?
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure schools are very careful. The law requires that the parent make the child available for the 3-year evaluation at the request of the public school. You do not have to proactively contact the school district to offer to have the child available. However, if they ask to reevaluate the child, you have to make the child available. So you have to say yes. And actually, unfortunately, I know of a few schools who've gotten caught up with this, where the school district says, could we do any 3-year reevaluation for the child? You have the right to decline, which is very parallel to how it would work in a public school setting. And the parents have declined and then found out that they then are no longer eligible for the SNSP. So don't resist the temptation to take the quote unquote option you're being offered, because that option may cause the student to lose eligibility, unfortunately.
Great point, Katie. Next question, Lauren.
Okay, what are some compelling reasons for a school to participate in the SNSP program? I assume if you're here, that you're seriously considering it, that you have probably already engaged in conversations with your faculty and your governing bodies about the possibility of moving into this program. So what are the reasons, that we would come down to? From my point of view, and I will call on Katie to answer this as well, it's an opportunity to grow enrollment through expanded services and unique distinguishers that you might set yourself apart with. So it's got some operational reasons why you might want to do it. I think it has also some opportunity to improve the quality of education for all the students in your school. More complex learners ultimately lead us to universal design for learning, which elevates the learning experience for all students. So it's a way to make your program better. It's a way to expand options for families that have a special education student by uniting the family members in a single school. And it's a way to build a better society, I believe, by facilitating relationships that are beneficial for everyone. The more diversity we bring into our schools, the more we enhance the capacity of our students as citizens in the wider world. So there are operational reasons to do it. There are qualitative reasons to do it. And there are human reasons to do it from my perspective. And there's probably a million other reasons. I don't know, Katie, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of what you said, Lauren, and I have not mentioned this yet, but I'll actually answer this from a different angle because I'm also a parent of a child with a disability, and actually a very significant set of disabilities. And he's currently included in our Catholic school. And I can tell you that from the family perspective, it is so important to keep siblings together in the same school. Undoubtedly, if you do not have a special education program already, you have had families in the past or currently have families who had to make a difficult decision to either separate their kids or perhaps not send them to your school at all when they otherwise would have chosen to do so. I'll also say that for my non-disabled children, the experience of having kids with disabilities in their school is so important. And that's really just mirroring what Lauren has already said. I also believe that this is the way of the future for private schools, especially as the funding has become available. And I know of families who have driven across town to send their children to an inclusive school. I know of families who have moved across town to do the same thing. Families are going to be looking for these programs, especially as they start to realize that there are a growing number of schools that offer them. And then the last thing I'd say is that from a parent's perspective, to me, a school that can serve students with really diverse needs is a high functioning school, a school that is ready to accept kids who have needs that fall outside the sort of narrow path. It's an indication that that school is functioning in a way that can adapt to kids of all different types. And I know my children will be well served by that school, even if they don't have a disability.
That was a really strong statement. I appreciate that, Katie. I think in the past that a lack of funding and a lack of expertise provided really legitimate barriers to schools accepting children with complex learning needs. But now I think we have to be honest and say that those barriers have all been obliterated. And programs like SNSP and organizations like FIRE are there to provide funding, to provide consultation and advocacy. The only thing that's left really is the will to take the risk, to take the next steps, and to get started.
I'm going to just add one other thing. This is not from the parent perspective, but more from the finance angle. Having been involved in several Catholic schools, high schools, elementary schools, having a finance background myself, I will say there is almost never a situation where private schools in this day and age have more money than they need. But I will say that watching schools implement the SNSP program and use it to fund special education services, this is one thing I would identify as an exception. If you're able to get your school up and running with full use of SNSP funds, as I mentioned earlier, you can really provide an incredibly high quality program that can serve the needs of a wide variety of children and essentially fund the entire thing out of the SNSP. I'm very confident of that, having seen several schools who are pretty far down the road have that experience.
Excellent input, y'all. There was a question out there about whether or not this, I believe it's referencing the modified IEP agreement, whether or not the local school district has to sign off on that. And the answer is no at that point in the game. So the local school district on the front end is the one still developing the IEP or service plan, to make them eligible to get into the SNSP program. Once they're in the SNSP program, the school's taking that IEP and using it as a baseline, basically, to determine what services that school is going to offer, and the parent has to sign off on that along with the school administrator. At that juncture, the public school does not need to sign off on it. Then there's quarterly reporting that we haven't really talked about, progress reports that you make and so forth. If the public's, my understanding, if the public school requests an update and access to that, then you need to be willing to share that. Lauren, is that?
That is correct.
Okay.
That was all very well said.
Thank you. Okay, so I know we're running out of time here, so I want to make sure we get to some real practical next steps, and then we will finish up with some lingering questions. So next step, first of all, the most important thing right now, if you're brand new to this, you should have gotten an email from DPI on last Friday the 9th, with information about upcoming training and registration and so forth. If you had been one of the schools that signed up what they call their interested parties list. If you did not get that, you can go onto the DPI website now for SNSP, and they have what's called an SNSP school information setup form. And I went through it today to play with it. It's very basic, easy. Just give them some basic information to kind of get you in their distribution list. There's no obligation with this, but if you're not on that, you're not going to get any of this information. So that's first step, I would have you do yet today to make sure you're in line for getting the information. DPI does have a virtual live training coming up on February 21st. So mark your calendar for that. You can sign up for that. If you do the school information update form, that's going to generate something. Otherwise, on their website, there's a link and so forth. And if you have any trouble with that, let me know and I can send you that. So that training for DPI is not mandated, but I would recommend it. They're going to walk through all the registration pieces very clearly and be able to answer questions. So that's on the 21st. Then March 1st, mark your calendar. That's a key date. You absolutely cannot be in the program next year, every school, whether you're continuing or brand new, unless you complete your intent to participate form on March 1st. What does that entail? That entails this special education profile that Lauren has spoken to a couple times. So you're going to want to start developing that, talking with your team and pulling that together, describing the services that you're going to be able to offer on this coming school year and the staff credentials of those that you know about. You're also going to determine the number of seats, the SNSP seats that you want to open up next fall. And so that sometimes takes a little thinking. And then you're going to be asked to choose whether or not you're going to purchase a surety bond to protect the state's financial interest in you, or whether or not you're going to complete what's called the DPI budget and cash flow report. So there's a variety of issues there that you're going to want to think about. I'd be happy to talk through those with you. If you are getting $50,000 or more through the SNSP scholarships next year, you have to do one of those two options, either the surety bond, which is kind of like an insurance product that you pay a premium for, or go through this budget process, which is very time consuming, very, very time consuming. So March 1st is around the corner. So if you're thinking that's what you're going to do and you haven't started that yet, please do so right away because it's very complex to do. Next, I just want to get these on your radar. Some additional dates, key dates for school registration. If you're a new school just joining the SNSP for the first time, you April 1st have to submit your IRS, your FEIN number, your tax number. Now, some of you are saying, oh, we've already did that for the choice program. We already sent that into DPI. Doesn't matter. This is a separate program and you have to do it again. So that is April 1st. And then May 1st, you're going to need to have a certificate of occupancy. Same thing. You might have done this a couple years ago to get in the choice program. You got to do it again. So that's May 1st. And then if you chose that surety bond option, which I will say most schools utilize that option, that bond needs to be completed and handed into DPI by June 3rd. Please allow time for that. The insurance process of underwriting and all of that takes time. So I would say, allow a couple months, get ahead of this so that you're not tripped up accidentally because you're waiting on this third party, this insurance company, to get you this bond. So just be cautious about getting on that quickly. And then in August, you're going to need your accreditation notice from your accrediting agency. So those are the detailed steps for getting in on the front end. And then I'll pause here and we can look at some other questions that came through. Let's see. Oh, this is an interesting question. Teresa asks, they have CISAs that service their children and they never get a quarterly report from them. I think this relates to the quarterly progress reports that you have to submit when you're in the SNSP. For instance, they have a vision impaired and hearing impaired person, it sounds like from a CISA that's hired to come in and work with them. Shouldn't they have to give a quarterly report? Lauren, how would you handle this as a school administrator?
Right. I would say that the school is ultimately responsible for monitoring the progress of the child. So the school should be requesting a report from those contracted providers if you're not already getting one, and incorporating it then into the school's report of the child's progress. As a school administrator, it's your responsibility to monitor the progress of a child holistically as it relates to the goals of the program. And if you have contracted providers who are providing services that facilitate some of that progress, you will need to get reports from them. It's really just that simple, and then incorporate it into your own overview of the child's progress.
I'll answer Lisa's question here. Do we open a general number of seats, or do we do it by grade level in that intent to participate? And you do it by grade level. So Lauren, I don't know if you want to speak to that later in terms of moving kids around grade levels, anything of that.
Well, I would just say that you want to start by taking a look at who's already in your school, as Katie mentioned earlier, and making sure that you have allotted seats for those students, and then looking at, how many total do we think we want to manage, in this first year, because this will be a year-by-year decision, and then looking at where you have spaces, to add children. So there is a form on which you will have to specify on a grade-by-grade basis exactly how many students you can accept. But then it's going to sort of collapse into, the K4, K5, and grades 1 through 8. And then if you're a high school, obviously high school. So, start by looking at those larger grade bands, but then you are going to have to really kind of drill down to the specific grades for how did we figure that out.
And what happens?
Could I just add something to that, Carol? You can actually open a seat at any time throughout the year. So if you have a student apply and you need another seat, you can open that seat as needed. But I just want to give a word of caution. Your surety bond would have to cover the additional seat. There's a flexibility to add maybe 2 more seats before your surety bond amount won't cover the payments you're receiving. And you cannot change your surety bond after September, after the September deadline. So when you choose an amount for your surety bond, just think about what would be maybe the surety bonds the premium's not that expensive. Think about maybe building in some room there should you have students you want to add to the program later in the year.
Yes, excellent. So back to those seats. If Kelly asks if she has 50 students in the program right now, can she ever reduce that? Like next year, could she reduce that amount, or does she have to guarantee seats for those 50 kids?
No, she could certainly reduce that, because this is a year-by-year application.
And then does the LEA have to create the IEP? This is a great question. A child does not qualify if they don't have one, but I read that they don't need to do this. Who would like to take that?
That's a very political question, and in my own district, we were in conflict about that. I think legally, I did check on it with an attorney, and legally, I think they do have to provide it. But there are some districts that are pretty hard-nosed about it. And they will send you back then ultimately to the child's district of residence, rather than the district in which they attend school. One way or another, they do have to have a public school IEP to apply for a voucher through this program. So you're going to have to advocate, for the child, whether you want to go head to head with a district who's refusing to do it, or just go to the child's district of residence. One of them will have to provide the IEP.
And I would add that DPI is willing to help in that too. The SNSP consultant, DPI actually on their website has a bulletin that's specific to answer questions of the local districts. And I believe it's question 16 on that talks about this. So it's the parent and not the school. if you get into that space that needs to do this. So the parent is the one with the right. And so the parent would be the one that would be asking their resident district at that point to create the IEP. And if at that juncture they're still getting pushback, they can call DPI and DPI will step in and try to help. Katie, did you have something to add with that?
I was just gonna say that you, basically what you said, Carol, if the district of residence refuses, they may say, well, the child's not gonna be placed here, so we don't prepare the IEP. The parent can say, I would not know if I would want to place my child until I see the IEP, and they will have to prepare it.
Jennifer asks, she says it's her first year doing the program. For next school year, do I include seats that are currently taken or just added spots? So on your intent to participate, you're going to have to include both. You're going to have spaces for those kids that are already there so that they can return, and then you can add and increase those seats in grade levels if you choose to do so. But the SNSP is unique in that way that unless a parent withdraws their child from the SNSP, you have to assume that they're coming back next year, and you're going to want to provide a spot for that student. The second question she had there is, what about the surety bond? Do we need a surety bond each year or just at initial registration? If you go the surety bond route, you do need it every year. And that's going to be recalculated. The amount of that surety bond is based upon the amount of scholarships that you'll be getting. So it's going to fluctuate, from year to year. And then mid-year, if you make changes to the number of seats, there's a whole bunch of guidance on that, different timelines. Basically, every time you make a change to your seats that causes a $50,000 or more incremental change, then that triggers the need to update that bond. You can do that throughout the year until the third Friday in September, and then it shuts down and you can't do that anymore. Anytime that your change is going to trigger that bond change. Chris asks if we want to join next year, do we have to have student IEPs written this spring, or can they be processed next year? So this is kind of a timing question.
Could I just go back and just add a little bit about the number of seats? I think the last question was asking about for students who are already here. There was an assumption in my mind that they already had SNSP seats. That is not correct. Those students, even if they're already enrolled in your school, are not enrolled in SNSP until July 1, if this is the first year that you're entering the program. And so what I would suggest is that you get out preliminary information to your students who are already in the building about how to, why and how to apply before July 1, so that they're the first ones to apply. Because as I said earlier, you do have to accept SNSP enrollments in the order received. So in your first year, this will be most critical because your current students, you obviously want to make sure that they get seats in the program. And then any additional seats would go to, new enrollees. In subsequent years, the students who are already in the program will continue in the program, so it's not as critical. But for your first year, you want to think about, drafting some sort of a nice communication to the parents of your current special education students to explain to them why they need to enroll and to encourage them to do it that first week of the enrollment, that July 1st week, if that makes sense.
And so in terms of getting those IEPs written in that timeline, you have students right now that maybe need to go through the evaluation process and they're starting from square one. How do they handle that if they're going to not be in the program until July 1st? When should they start that process for those students?
Well, a school district has 60 days to write an IEP once the referral has been made. So just, do the math, and I would add another 30 days to that, frankly, just to give yourself a little bit of a cushion, because they are going to need to have the IEP completed before July 1. And a lot of districts will cut off new evaluations sometime in the spring, to make sure that they have, that 60 days to get the evaluation process done. So, you really want to start thinking about this really relatively soon and refer any students for evaluation that you are pretty certain are going to qualify for special education if you want them to be enrolled in SNSP for this upcoming school year.
I would just add a couple other things as it relates to the timeline. So you can join the program, the cutoff date being March 1st, and have 0 students in the program when the school year starts. But what Lauren is saying is that if you do want those kids in the program as soon as possible, so, of course, begin in earnest to obtain those IEPs. But if you don't think you're going to get any of them before the September count date, that's okay. You can be in the program with 0 students enrolled, even for the whole school year. And then you can add those kids as the IEPs come on board. There was a question earlier about what time of year you can admit students. And I just wanted to add one thing about that. So they have to be added before the September count date to get the full amount of the scholarship, before the January count date to get a half scholarship. But once you're in the program, once you begin your first school year in the program, you can add students at any time throughout the year, including after the January count date. And I would encourage you to just add students as soon as you can, as soon as they have an IEP. It would be not common that these issues would come up, but there's 2 specific reasons. One is if you add a student after the January count date, and then they later become no longer qualify for the IEP, you would still receive a partial scholarship payment for that student next year, even though they never received an earlier scholarship, the full amount in a prior year. So you can begin in earnest providing services, knowing that you're at least going to get that partial scholarship the next year. The other reason, and this will be much more rare, but is important to know, if you have a student who ends up being an actual cost student, the actual cost amounts are includable from the date that the student was admitted. It's not based on the count date. So if you add a student in, November, they don't qualify for a scholarship until the January count date half payment. But if you end up filing a statement of actual cost, you can include those expenses going back to November. So it's good to just add kids as soon as they're eligible.
Okay, and I'm gonna just let people know, I realize we're over time and people might have other commitments. I'm happy to stay on and answer a few more questions, but we understand if you need to leave, and thank you so much for joining us. I did put a few more questions up here, 2 more slides that these are questions that came in advance that may or may not have been clearly addressed through our session, and I'm gonna just touch on those. And again, if you want to stick around and keep asking questions, I'm fine with that. One of the people in advance asked about the audits, what to expect. I've put them there. There's a fall and a spring enrollment audit, and then that gap financial audit at the end of every year that usually is happening late summer. The different due dates for the budgets is confusing for folks that are in both the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program and the SNSP. They are 2 separate things that need to be submitted. So there's a May 1st for the Wisconsin program and March 1st for the SNSP if you're choosing that budget option. The mid-year IEP SNSP applications, I think we were just talking about that. Remember that the SNSP has a unique 365-day-a-year application period. That is so amazing. So families can come in at any juncture and make an application. For you brand new folks, you can't do that yet because they wouldn't open up for you until July 1st. But for those schools that are already in the program, students right now could make application for the SNSP, even if you don't have seats. They would just go on a waiting list. The question came in about minimum number of students, and kind of secondarily, do you ladies have any recommendations on what you would say and the staffing numbers to support students? So that minimum number of students, no, technically there's no minimum number of students. I think from my perspective, it's really perhaps a financial question in terms of if you are not in the choice program, suddenly you are going to have these audits, and they're very expensive. If you're already in the choice program, then there's going to be just a small incremental difference, added to it for the additional SNSP portion. So that's how I would be looking at that evaluation, is whether or not, if you're only in the SNSP program, how many students are you going to need to bring in to cover those costs? Having said that, if you're only in the SNSP program, the cost of the audit can be covered by the SNSP scholarship. And so keep that in mind with your calculation too. I know some of those calculations might feel like they get kind of dicey, but I do want to touch quickly on that staffing number to support students. I'm going to pitch that one over to you ladies. Who would like to talk about that?
Well, I guess the way I would answer it would be to say that depends entirely on the needs of the students that are enrolled. I don't think you can answer that question in a generic way. If you have 6 students with complex intellectual disabilities, for example, versus children with emotional disabilities versus children with physical disabilities, you're going to need different kinds of staffing, as well as potentially different numbers of staff. Children with intellectual disabilities likely are going to need a personal aide that will accompany them to all of their classes, as well as the special education teacher who's going to teach the ELA and the math instruction separate from content area classes, where they'll probably be included with their grade level peers. So it really depends on the kinds of students that you're enrolling and their specific range of needs. And I would be happy to consult with anyone who has specific questions on that.
And then the accreditation notice, Jamie had requested that DPI will actually send out a notice to your accrediting agency asking for that every year, sometime in July, I believe. It's due August 1st. So that accreditation notice would be, you would need to have your school for the SNSP accredited prior to that August 1st date. If they're not accredited by then, you would have to go through it. In the SNSP, they have kind of a unique process where you can ask DPI to review your curriculum and plans and kind of give their stamp of approval. And I can walk you through that kind of offline. Otherwise, have that accreditation before the kids are in there. That's the idea. So ready for August. The average number of SNSP students that we're seeing in programs around the area, Kelly, it's total vary. We have schools that have one SNSP child. We have schools that have 80, or more. So it varies dramatically across the spectrum. And then Chris's question, if the IEP ends up not recommending any services, but yet we know there are needs that we can meet, is this a usable document for us or not?
It is not a usable document for enrolling the child in the SNSP program, but as Katie said so eloquently earlier, the funding that you will receive through SNSP for children who do qualify will enhance programming for all the students in your school. So a child who has needs that do not meet classification for special education in the state of Wisconsin, but are still tricky to resolve in general education, can benefit from the kinds of services that you're bringing in for children who are specifically funded through SNSP.
And then I put on the slides there a couple other questions that came in for those who were specifically interested. We didn't talk really about this category called primary expenses for SNSP. We talked about the actual cost. And so just so that you're clear, in the SNSP program, it's unique with the funding. There's a base of roughly $15,000 for an SNSP student. And then Katie talked through how kind of the sky's the limit with that student that's using the actual cost model and has more substantial needs. For the kids that are not on the actual cost model, they're on the regular model, I'm going to call it. They're going to get that 15,000. But within that 15,000 on the back end, when the audit is happening and they're looking at your educational expenses and they're trying to come up with the reserve balance, etc., in that part of the calculation, they have a mechanism that they allow you for SNSP expenses if an expense is 50% or more, and that's their technical term for primarily, supporting SNSP students. And again, this would include, for instance, the enrollment audit for the SNSP program that you're not going to have if you were not in the SNSP program, right? So any expense, whether it's 100%, maybe it's a one-on-one aid, or whether it's an expense that you've allocated, maybe you have 10 kids in the class and 6 of them are in the SNSP program, not a general education teacher, but if you have a special needs program or special needs teacher, aide, etc., that's focusing on that, DPI will let you mark those and kind of target those expenses, those allocated expenses, and kind of peel it right off the top of that scholarship. And so you're getting the 15, and maybe those allocated expenses might be quite substantial, and maybe 10,000 of that you could say were primarily SNSP expenses. You do that first, and then as you move down through the formula, they allow you to include those general expenses, the base educational costs that every single child that comes through your building has. And that includes, for your maintenance and janitorial and recess and all the rest, right? So you're able to do that, but it's really great. You can target these expenses that are SNSP focused first and maximize those SNSP dollars. I know that that's confusing, and we're running out of time here. Happy to talk more about that later with anyone who wants additional coaching on that or information on that. Any last minute comments before we sign off here, Katie and Lauren? All right. Well, we thank you so much for joining, everyone. We will have this slide deck and recording available to you, and we wish you the best and hope that this program facilitates some great opportunities for your schools. Take care, everyone.